Dignitatis Humanae. So what does Vatican II say about religious liberty? Vatican II issued Dignitatis Humanae, a declaration of religious liberty, and it says, quote, "The Vatican Synod declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that in matters religious, no one can be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs." So far, the Church agrees with that. We don't believe in forcing anyone to become a Catholic or any sort of thing like that. So far, but the next line is what messes things up. "Nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accordance with his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits." Now you think, well, all right, well, the due limits might fix it. No, due limits does. The only due limits that they put on it pretty much is disturbing the peace, the peace of the community. So, important points about this passage. Let's take a look at it. First of all, it says that Vatican II not only says that no one should be forced to believe, which is the Church has always taught, but also claims that no one can be restrained from practicing the religion of his choice. Now, the religion of your choice does not necessarily mean an established religion. You can develop your own religion and believe that sodomy is perfectly fine, and you can't be stopped from doing that. From your privately or publicly. Second, then, and this is paramount, Vatican II no longer speaks of tolerance alone, but actually recognizes a real natural right of people of all religions to be hindered in the practice of their religion. This is contrary to 2,000 years of Catholic teaching. Third, this right not only concerns the practice in private, but also public worship and the propagation of that religion. Thus, Vatican II promotes something that the Church has always previously condemned. So how could the Church do this? How could Vatican II do this? Well, first of all, it didn't get done until the very last part of the Council. Within days of ending the Council, they pushed this through because there were so many problems with it, and there still are problems with it. But they had to justify it somehow. This idea that error, the Church's idea that you can't justify error, the error has no rights. They had to get around that. So how did they do that? The Declaration of Religious Liberty bases it on the dignity of the human person. That's why it's called Dignitatis Humanae. Quote, "The Council further declares that the right of religious freedom has its foundation in the dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself." They're trying to come in through a back door. They're trying to use an entirely different viewpoint. And again, because the Vatican was not infallible, the language they were using was they weren't defining anything, or they weren't backing anything up. They were just throwing things out there, and they didn't have to prove this connection. So it was necessary to use this sophism to bypass the condemnation that error has no rights. So they decided to consider things from the viewpoint of persons who had the ability to reason, to be able to adhere freely to religion. And their idea is that in order to adhere freely to religious truth, you have to be exempt from constraint in matters of religion. No. There's you can say that, you can throw that out there, but that's not true. Changing the viewpoint doesn't change the fact that religious liberty itself is contrary to the Church and her teaching and practice. It just clouds the issue. Remember that human dignity is based on truth and goodness. So one should then consider that since the Catholic Church contains all truth, then true religious liberty, if you're basing it on human dignity, can only be found in the Catholic Church. And that is true religious liberty. But that's not what they're saying. So an expert on the council, Father Berto, pointed out, and I'm going to read his quotation because there's, on my notes I only quoted a little bit of it, but really it's worth reading the whole thing. So Father Berto says, in response to this statement, not everyone is an adult, and many adults of age are not so by intellect. Now, their reason is faulty. The schema ignores the timid. It ignores the slaves of sin. It ignores the pressure of the passions. It ignores the spreading of errors by perverse men. And it imagines an angelic man. Where in the world and on what planet does this schema put us? From a child's tenderest age and attaining the use of reason, there are moral problems to resolve. And far from having a right to be left to itself to resolve them, the child has a right not to be left to itself, but rather to be helped by the counsels, the commands, the injunctions, and the paddle of its parents and educators to resolve its moral problems with rectitude. The child has a right to have its freedom limited. That's his true right, to have its freedom limited. It has the right to have those in charge order it to do what is inherently right. And the parents and the educators who abdicate from ordering, prescribing, ordaining, and spanking fail in a very serious duty and heavily burden their consciences before God. The same ought to be said analogously of most men who are not able to overcome even vincible errors unless the errors are kept far from them by those who have received the duty, and they can, as it were, breathe the truth. Just as the sick people are sent to a sanitarium so that they can breathe the fresh air of the mountains or the seashore to rebuild their strength, and who can escape the noxious air of the city, likewise the human race, sick from original sin and manifold actual sins, has a right not to an unlimited religious freedom, but on the contrary, to such restraint on religious freedom that by using their liberty men embrace the truth. This does not mean that people are forced to embrace the faith against their will, but rather that the stupid and the weak are placed in a situation in such that they can more easily discern and choose the truth. Unlimited religious freedom, besides being inherently bad, opens the door to error to the great detriment of the rights of the weak and the ignorant. Since in this world error has such power, all those endowed with authority of whatever degree, parents over their children, the state over its citizens, the church over the baptized, have a very serious duty, whether natural or supernatural, to protect those in their charge from error. Some say that truth can defeat error all by itself without the help of any authority. This will be true the day when men are no longer men, but supermen or super angels. I have sufficiently shown above that error finds its accomplices within us and among us. What he says is, there's no way to say it better, and to put it in very concisely. So, the child has a right to have his freedom limited, and so do anyone else. All of us have the right to have our freedom limited in order that we can choose what is true. Freedom is not an absolute value. It was given to man so that he might freely choose good. Freedom is a consequence of reason. It was necessary for man to be able to love God. That's why he made us, to love him. So in order to love him, God had to give us reason, intellect, to be able to reason, and free will. Because love that is not free is not love. Love that is not freely given. So in order to choose to love, he had to give us free will. And in order to use free will properly, he had to give us reason, intellect. God intended for us to love him, and therefore to choose good, to choose him. But God doesn't force love. So as a consequence, man has the ability to choose evil. To choose evil, therefore, is an abuse of freedom. Man, then, has the ability to do evil, but not the right to do evil. The man who chooses evil abuses the freedom that God gave him. As we have said before, Vatican II presents the right not to be impeded from acting in accordance with one's conscience in religious matters, as a genuine natural right based on the dignity of the human person. And that dignity of your human, in other words, they're saying you can't, also saying man has to go by his conscience. And it's true that man must act according to his conscience. But he first has the duty to enlighten his conscience. Because the conscience is not the ultimate criteria of good or evil. It's only an intermediary transmitting an obligation that does not depend upon it. Your conscience that God gave you in your innocence, if you maintain that, you'll be fine. But we don't. We change our conscience. We train it. As Fulton Sheen says, we will have to, God will judge us by how we acted according to our conscience, but the conscience that he gave us, not the one that we made for ourselves. And because of original sin, we tend to make it over. So, for example, let's suppose that a murderer is subjectively innocent because his false religion inculcated into him the conviction that murder is fine. Murder is licit in certain conditions. Yet this subjective conviction does not give him the objective right. And so the policeman who stops him from carrying out his act does not commit an injustice. Someone who could affirm that murder is certainly bad, but that the murderer has, because of his human dignity, the right not to be prevented from killing anyone he wants, would be called crazy. Yet this is just exactly what Dignitatis Humanae claims. This document teaches that all men have the duty to seek the truth and to receive it, but it adds that if someone knowingly or unknowingly adheres to error, he has the right not to be prevented from acting in accordance with that error, in the name of his human dignity. So if a man believes that sodomy is perfectly correct, or that it's okay to beat his wife, or that abortion is perfectly fine. He shouldn't be prevented from doing that, according to this. Persons mistaken in good faith about moral issues certainly deserve to be treated with charity and prudence. That's only justice. But that person doesn't thereby acquire the right to disseminate its error. He can't go around teaching everybody that it's perfectly all right to murder, that it's perfectly all right to beat your wife. These things are wrong. They remain wrong. And the person doesn't have a right to, either through the internet, through Facebook, through other social media, through a blog, through radio, through television, to disseminate his error. The Church rightly considers the diffusion of heresy as murder committed against souls. And that would be, this is heresy. So what are the consequences of religious liberty? We're now, how many years since the council? 40, 50, 60? Close to 60 years, past 50 years since the council. So how has this changed the world? It has. It has. The first consequence was that the states that were still officially Catholic had to change their constitutions. Examples of this can be found in Colombia, a country that was 98% Catholic. The president reluctantly had to yield to pressure exerted by the Vatican in the name of the council and change its constitution. And immediately the country was flooded with missionaries from other cultures and cults, mostly Protestant, backed with money from the United States, to go into the country and work on converting the people from the Catholic faith to their religions. Similar situation occurred in Spain and in Switzerland. There were two cantons in Switzerland that were Catholic. That's why the Swiss card is chosen from one of those cantons. For generations and generations and generations, they held to the faith. They had to change their constitutions. Another consequence was that Vatican II showed the truth of Leo XIII's statement that religious liberty necessarily leads to immorality. I'm sure you can see how it could lead to immorality if whatever you believe is, if you believe that immorality is part of your religion and then you are allowed to practice it publicly and to promote it publicly, of course it will lead to immorality. And we can see that it has. Not only has the faith disappeared from formerly Catholic countries, but morality has as well. Countries like Ireland now have divorce and abortion. Marriages fail, families break up, criminality rises, and the world is descending into chaos. Now in the United States, in the name of being politically correct, there are things you can't talk about. You can't talk about morality publicly. Immorality you can. You can talk be as immoral as you want publicly, but don't try and criticize that immorality publicly. That is politically incorrect. You can be arrested for hate crimes because you're going against someone else's religion or religious beliefs. Society will never really change until society once again recognizes Christ as its king and refuses to give free rein to error. That was one of the things also that came out of the Vatican Council, the Dignitatis Humanae. We no longer recognize Christ as the king of the world. They refer to Christ the king. Yes, the church still does, but his kingdom will come at the end of the world. I'm afraid we are closing in on the end of the world, and he will come. For as Cardinal Pie stated, when he does not reign by the benefits attached to his presence, he reigns by the calamities inseparable from his absence. Think about that. I'm going to repeat that again. When Christ does not reign by the benefits attached to his presence, he reigns by the calamities inseparable from his absence. Next time, ecumenism.